Cool. Well, that seems like a segue to talk about some of the background information leading up to this record. We're going to cover a bit of Joni's story. For this week, I read a book called Reckless Daughter about Joni Mitchell's life and times. So I'll be drawing heavily from that, but I also watched a documentary or two about her and listened to some podcast interviews and things like that. So this story, as so many stories of fierce rock and roll poetic feminism begins in the plains of central Canada. Now, born Roberta Joan Anderson, November 7th, 1943, to a grocery store owner in Alberta. But luckily, the family quickly abandons that big city and moves to a similarly or even more rural Canadian province, Saskatchewan. This is like, we're talking the middle of Canada, both of these places, extremely rural, lots of big open areas. And Joni said time and time again, she credited a lot of her sonic ideas from growing up around these big open spaces. She said, where a single sound is laden with meaning, as opposed to the city where sounds are all jumbled together. And she says that musicians from cities make a different kind of music because of that. Makes some sense.
Yeah.
So an important turning point in her life is she gets polio as a kid. There's a polio epidemic. There's a polio epidemic in Canada in the early 1950s. This is after World War II, but just before the Salk vaccine becomes widely available. And I was reading
that the same polio epidemic that got Neil Young?
It absolutely is.
All right.
And Neil Young is also from the Central Plains of Canada, and they were friends and remained friends. I think remain friends to this day. They were good buddies. Even though they didn't grow up together, they came from a similar place. But I was reading about this polio epidemic and what it must have been like. It's a disease. It's highly contagious, especially amongst kids. There's really no treatment for it. They're just treating symptoms. There's a whole bunch of variants, but one variant leads consistently to paralysis of some sort. And I think something like 15% of that variant leads to death or permanent paralysis. It just must have been an insane time, right? Before that vaccine came around.
Yeah.
But no autism.
Oh, come on.
that we know of.
Yeah.
So Joni gets it and she loses her ability to walk for a while, but she fights hard to get it back. She's like 10 at this point, and her parents have to send her to a polio colony. It's like an orphanage for polio patients, or similar to a leper colony. This was the move at the time. She's a 10-year-old. And on top of that, the people in the colony tell her that even moving around in bed is going to make it worse. So she's just laying there alone in an orphanage in a bed by herself. Her parents can't even come to visit her. Her mom comes once in the 6 months she's at this facility where she's just laying still all the time. It just sounded insane.
So basically she has no trauma.
Exactly.
Totally fine.
This experience is, according to her, a big part of what pushed her to be an artist, because before that she was very outdoorsy, very athletic, and this experience sent her looking inward, right? So she does fight physical therapy. She fights through and works to regain her ability to walk and recovers from the virus, but she has, I believe to this day, retained some numbness in her left hand, which is part of the reason she retuned the guitar to make some of the fingerings easier, and it adds to her originality of her guitar style in an interesting way.
Now, just a quick question you said that she had to go to this leper colony / polio camp or whatever the hell it is. Like, did they force her to do that? Because that sounds like, as a parent, I would never do that. Like, you just got really sick and you're super worried about your future. Anyway, just go over there with these strangers for the next 6 months, and maybe I'll write around Christmas or something.
This was just standard protocol in the middle of Canada. This is what they did.
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's not like she was packed into. It's not like there were so many kids around that it was going to, continue to catch on. I think they were just so freaked out because it was an epidemic.
And also, was it like for her whole childhood, or was it just for like a couple weeks?
It was for 6 months when she was 10.
Okay. Substantial.
Yeah. Okay. That was when she was isolated, but I think she was going through this for significantly longer than that, not able to walk and kind of working back to some normal functionality of being a kid. So it definitely had a big impact on her.
Brutal. Yeah.
Yeah.
So for a while after this, she was studying painting, and really she continued to paint throughout her life. This is long before she started playing music or writing songs. And she talks about how she had this one great teacher in the 6th grade who told her, if you can paint with a brush, you can paint with words. And I bring that up because actually I think a lot of what she's doing in the songcraft, lyric writing, singing, or the chord structures is very much like painting. It's very much, I think, influenced by her artistic training. And she ends up going to art school for a little while, like learning about color theory. So she's technically trained as a visual artist. And I do think that helps put the music it makes it a little easier to understand.
And she's a pretty talented artist too.
Absolutely.
She did
Absolutely.
some album covers and stuff.
Yeah. Like I said, it's something she's continued with off and on, but she's continued to be pretty serious about it for her entire life.
Well, talking about album covers, nothing screams more "I am an artist" than this album cover. By the way, a beret and a cigarette. Oh,
And
yes.
though, to be fair, I think the artist really captured the mood of Joni Mitchell at this time and the mood of this album. Like, it is a fitting album cover, and
It is.
Yeah.
she just doesn't seem like she suffers any fools ever.
Yeah,
And that's
she's
what
got
that's
some
what her face
sass
is
in that
saying.
pose. Yes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, okay. So flash forward to high school. She saves up $36 to buy a ukulele and teaches herself to play it. Now, she wanted a guitar, but her mother didn't like the implications of that instrument.
Fun fact: ukulele still cost $36.
Right, yeah. Inflation has not affected the ukulele industry at all. So we're at 1960 approx now. Now, she's not an amazing student. She actually barely finished high school. She flunked chemistry. She flunked physics. So what does she do? What does every flunking high school student decide to do? They head to art school in Calgary, the big city. Now, I should point out there's like 200,000 people or less living in Calgary right now. So I'm going to guess that it was significantly smaller in 1960. But okay, it's the big city to her, right? I should point out too, she also has this really strong sense of fashion in addition to the painting stuff. So art school made sense for her on a couple different levels. She's making her own clothes. She's being artsy in her small town already. It's in college where she decides to learn guitar from a random folk instructional book. And then she quickly gives up on the book and just says, I'll figure it out myself. Fuck this. And I think this anecdote says a lot about her personality. This is like her attitude from here forward. Like, don't tell me what to do. Instructional book. I shall sort it out on my own. So
I mean, she was probably thinking the same thing as she was lying in bed for 6 months. Fuck this,
Yeah.
I mean,
Of
that's
course.
probably where it started,
absolutely. And it's not like the instruction booklets were so great at the time. This was folk music. This was traditional music. This is before the guitar revolution or the very, very early days of it, of rock and roll, right? And so she's thinking about folk music and becoming a folk singer. It's a big influence on her. And speaking of folk music and Joni's influences, I came across this and I thought it was a fascinating little story of a guitar player, who influenced Joni in these early days. Her name is Elizabeth Cotton. I don't know if you guys have heard of her, but she's a self-taught guitar player, a black woman born in the late 1800s, who's credited with actually inventing the folk picking style of the bass notes interspersed with melodies and other chord tones, which is sometimes called cotton picking, which is an interesting homonym to I think, racist phrase, but sometimes cotton picking can refer to specifically this act of how you pick bass notes. It's basically what all country and folk players did from that point on. And so what she was doing at the time was very innovative. She combined traditional banjo style picking with guitar, ends up influencing the entire folk movement of the 50s and 60s. And what I thought was really interesting about her story is she was discovered, in quotes, in her older years while working as a maid at a wealthy family's house, because one day she just picks up an old acoustic guitar and it turns out she could shred. And the family in that house was a mother named Ruth Crawford Seeger, and one of the children in that house was Pete Seeger.
Wow.
Well, I also talk about adding to your fuck this attitude when you're like a maid working for a rich family. That's got to be a demoralizing fucking job. You go back to your tiny ass apartment after cleaning somebody's palatial mansion all day. I wouldn't be able to stand that.
Yeah. But the good news is she did eventually get somewhat of her due, I suppose. Her most well-known recording is a song called Freight Train. We'll put it on the show playlist if you want to check it out. It's kind of like a John Fahey, Doc Watson type player, but from at least a generation before.
Yeah, I
those
feel
folks.
like she was found when they were doing those Smithsonian Folkways kind of collections where they're trying to find, all of the lost American music in the, I don't know, 50s.
Oh yeah, the Lomax brothers, the guys who
Lomax
like
brothers,
traveled
yeah.
around the country trying to record people. That might be
Mhm.
where she was actually recorded.
Mhm.
Okay, so anyway, back to our story. The folk revival is happening. It's 1960-ish. Joni's in it. She's playing small clubs. At this point, she's moved on to a baritone ukulele and sometimes a guitar. She's playing sea shanties and Scottish folk tunes, as was the style at the time. I assume Ween's Cold Blows the Wind was in the repertoire, but and then what happens? She gets pregnant. Now, the father of the baby is just a friend who dips out on any parental responsibility pretty much immediately. So Joni decides to drop out of art school and move to Toronto, a significantly bigger place. It's much closer to New York, which is the epicenter of the folk scene, and her intention is to be a professional folk singer. And they talk about how on the train ride east to the train ride on the train ride to the east of Canada, she's going across almost the whole of Canada, the plains of Canada, is where she writes her very first song, a song called Day After Day. So she's just starting to think about writing her own material. Because if you think about it, a lot of the folk music, and she would continue on this line for a while, was really just about repackaging traditional songs from the past, right? So, okay, this is interesting. She gets to Toronto, the actual big city. She joins this movement and she finds out she's more or less locked out. To play any of the bigger clubs on the scene, she needs to be in the musicians union, but she can't afford the $200 fee to join. So she's busking and playing these tiny non-union places. And as you might imagine, in addition to that, she quickly realizes that singing old traditional songs, like I just mentioned, which are technically completely rights free, is a bit of a fraught exercise because the other folk singers, the veteran folk singers from those scenes in Toronto, have already claimed them. And I just bring this up to emphasize that sadly, even the most egalitarian seeming of artistic movements manage to have their cliques and in-group, out-group
Right.
mentality. And I'm sure sexism is almost certainly a part of this
There's
too.
there's dickheads everywhere.
There's dickheads everywhere. Yeah, she's like, you can't play that song. She's like, what are you talking about? That song's 100 years old. Nope, that's old Johnny's. Okay, but the good news is that this is part of what pushes her to start writing her own songs and performing her own songs. So in Toronto, she meets a local performer called Chuck Mitchell. Keep in mind, her name at this point is Joan Anderson, right? And she breaks the ice with this guy after his set by telling him that he's playing Mr. Tambourine Man incorrectly, which I assume from the anecdote she is correct about.
Which is different than Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man.
I mean Bob Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man.
Okay, it's called Mr.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Mr. Tambourine Man.
Okay, got it.
So at this point, she's had her kid already.
That was my question.
Yeah, it's a good question. The timeline is a little weird. So I think she's either just about to have this kid and they get together, they date briefly and marry, and her hope is that they're going to raise this kid together. But it might be right after she has the kid, and maybe the kid goes to foster care for a little while awaiting some kind of adoption, but she has this fantasy about having a domestic home life with this guy Chuck Mitchell. Doesn't really work out that way. But
I mean, I was just picturing like tiny, waifish, polio-ridden, pregnant Joni Mitchell busking on the streets of Toronto.
yeah, in the winter.
Yeah.
Right. I was wondering if that was part of the reason why she was potentially ousted. Who's this blonde pregnant woman coming in trying to sing all our songs?
Yeah.
Could be a factor, right? So yeah, so as you mentioned, and whether that happens before she marries Chuck Mitchell or after, I'm not really certain, but they have a quick courtship, hoping that they're going to have this happy family life and they're going to be able to raise this kid together.
One thing, Rob, is that maybe we skipped over, but she has this real insane voice and insane range. I mean, is that just from like singing out in the fields of Saskatchewan, or?
I don't think there's an environmental explanation for that. I think it's just a gift that she has been singing since a relatively early age and working on that. And
turns out the secret is polio.
Well, in some of her songs on other albums, she talks about singing in church choirs and stuff. So maybe that's kind of.
Oh, I see. You know what? Yeah, I gotta admit, I actually started and got about halfway through a different biography of Joni that was even less straightforward, but I get the impression she does not like to reveal a lot of information about
Oh, wow.
herself to interviewers. So they were all a little abstract in their approach to the facts. Let me put it that way.
I'm going to take a wild stab and say that rural Saskatchewan in the 50s was probably pretty religious. Probably a lot of church activity going on there.
Good. It's a good bet. It's a good bet. Yeah, for sure. So, and she did recover from polio, so maybe she found religion. But honestly, I don't think religion came up once in anything I heard from her, but it's possible she's religious as well. But okay, in any case, her daughter, I wanted to mention her daughter, who ends up getting adopted. And of course, Joni ends up breaking up with Chuck Mitchell. They're not married for very long, although she keeps his name forever, indefinitely, till now. But this story about her having had a daughter put up for adoption isn't public at all until the 1990s. And so it's a private sorrow of Joni's. A lot of Joni's songs over the years have probably, because she's not super open about what her songs are about, have been about the sorrow of giving up this child. And it's kind of informed a lot of her career. And she kept it private for many, many years. But okay, so like I said, Joni gets married to this guy. She changes her name to Mitchell. She also gets American citizenship because Chuck is American. And when they marry, she's like 21 years old. I mean, she sews her own wedding dress. This is the era we're in, and this is the type of person we're talking about. And they are making a living together playing folk music, but of course, just barely. So from Toronto, they moved to Detroit together to try to be successful. They quickly realize that that's not going to work, that New York is the only real option, so they head there. Now she's in New York. It is the epicenter of this scene. She's playing up and down the East Coast for a couple years in coffee houses, starting to slowly but surely work in her own original material into the show. And one night, a guy called Tom Rush, another folk singer, hears her sing one of her own songs. It's called Both Sides Now. And immediately, according to him, says he knows it's a hit. So with
I didn't realize that song wasn't one of her first recordings, was it? I thought that she.
I'm about to tell you.
Oh God! So excited! I just can't contain myself.
So what happens? I know it is a little bit of a weird chronology with this song because I think she eventually records it, but it's on like her third album, which we could touch on that momentarily. But first, it's made a hit by other artists, and then Joni later re-recorded it. I think as late as the 90s. It was made a
hit by Judy Collins. Had a huge hit with it.
Oh. So basically, this other folk singer hears her sing it in the club, goes, "This is a hit. I know a famous folk singer, Judy Collins, who is looking for hits." Right? And immediately, with Joni's permission, calls Judy Collins to insist that she record it. And she does. And it's a hit. And I should point out, Tom Rush quickly also records it, as does another country musician. And it charts on a few different charts. You know, it's a legitimate hit. And you guys and astute listeners may recall that Judy Collins has come up a couple times before on our podcast. Now, I don't think any Judy Collins albums are on Robert Dimery's list, but she is a pop singer who had many hits in the 60s and helped bring people like Leonard Cohen into prominence. She recorded and released his song Suzanne before he cut an album, but also I'd be remiss if I didn't mention she dated Stephen Stills, and Sweet Judy Blue Eyes is named after her.
It's also funny that, she wasn't allowed to sing these folk songs that other people claimed in the Toronto clubs, and then writes a song and she also can't sing that song because everyone else has also claimed it.
Yeah, it is funny. Well, it brings to mind another story I heard about Bob Dylan's first album, that he took on that first album. He does a version of House of the Rising Sun, which is one of those traditional songs, and that his friend and like early mentor, I think his name's Dave Van Ronk, who was he's sort of a generation before Bob Dylan, so he was an older mentor type to Bob Dylan. He had been performing that song around New York City. It was considered his song, and he was kind of pissed at Dylan. Dylan just kind of took the arrangement, got it into the studio, and then kind of claimed it by putting it to tape.
That's funny. He also, there's also a guy on that Dylan documentary that talks about Dylan coming over and him showing his like prized, rare folk collection, and then like coming back the next day and the records were mysteriously disappeared.
Oh,
I could see Dylan being a bit of a shady character for sure. Yeah. So, okay, we're talking about this song. It's Joni's first breakthrough song, and even though she won't record it herself for a little while, like I mentioned, let's just play a snippet of the Judy Collins version of Both Sides Now. So this song is released as a single in 1968 by Judy Collins. It wins the Grammy that year for Best Folk Song. This lands Joni a record deal, but honestly, she's already a known quantity on the hip songwriter scene in New York. She's dating Leonard Cohen for a time. And then in Florida, where everything interesting happens, one night at a small show, she meets David Crosby. And he sees her set. He's completely bowled over by her. And she decides to head to LA with him because he, reminder, is coming off of his stint in the Byrds. He's kind of a known quantity, and he is ultimately going to help her career along. So
I'm guessing part of that was that he was also smitten with her.
Absolutely, they dated for a period.
Yes.
Oh yeah, yeah.
She seems bewitching. And I feel like the through line of the story is that then she meets a guy and he's like, I am obsessed with you now.
I think
I think
that's
she
an accurate
has
word.
she has strong mojo. I think she
Yeah.
wants these men to fall in love with her, and then it's fodder for her writing.
Yeah,
good for
and
her.
I'll add to that she seems to be quite a heartbreaker. She's not the one getting her heart broken in general. She seems to be the one that's
No.
that
Once
blowing
again,
these guys
in
off.
control. Yeah,
Absolutely.
definitely in control.
Well, and honestly, like guy rock stars do that shit all the time. Good for her,
Good for
breaking
her.
down the walls.
Good
Seriously.
for her, but she did not get a good rap for it back then.
Yeah.
Unfair.
Yeah.
Unfair.
That's bullshit.
No, double standard.
Yeah.
Okay, so Crosby agrees to produce her first album, right? She's already got this record contract. He's like, I'll help you. I'll put my name on it. Now, it doesn't do amazing, in part because David Crosby is such a noob at producing, as even he admits freely. But it is super helpful for her to have these established artists tout her as great. It helps give her the confidence to keep going, to keep writing. And they talked about this weird, speaking of why Both Sides Now was not on her first, or I believe even her second album. There was a weird idea about when you got a record contract back then about saving the good stuff for the follow-up. It makes no sense in 2024 really, but she purposely saved what she thought of as her best songs for not the first release.
Yeah,
I
that
wish
doesn't
more-
make any sense.
I wish more bands did that, save something for the second album.
Yeah, but then you don't get a second album a lot of the time.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially back then, didn't labels back then, you signed and it was a one record deal, right? And if it didn't do well, you were out.
I think you were more likely to get a multi-record deal, and what's more is you were more likely to have that deal carry through for longer. Like in the same way that I think there was just more patience to let artists develop. I think you could say the same thing about, TV shows getting extra seasons even though they didn't have as big an audience, let's say in the 80s and 90s. And now there's this emphasis on make it immediately or you're out, right?
Yeah. I also feel like back in the day, there was a lot of, you're still under contract, but we just have no interest in putting your stuff out. And so we're just going to hold your contract for a while and you can record if you want to, but I'm not fucking promoting it. I'm not releasing it. I'm not putting any
A lot
marketing
of
behind
bands,
it.
yeah.
Or the people that want out of their contract and just record some shit album like the Neil Young doo-wop album.
Yeah. Or the Van Morrison Spite album, which is fantastic.
Yeah, but it does sound like she was just you said the word bewitching. Like if you saw her live, you couldn't help but think she was destined to be a star. And, one more piece of context there that's kind of interesting is her stuff in these early days, as you might imagine, is just her and a guitar, which in 1968, when her first album actually gets released, is very odd for young hip music, right? The folk era has sort of come and gone. Dylan has gone electric at this point. She's a bit out of sync with the times, but I think that also is what helps her stand out.
Well,
the dulcimer? Oh no, I was gonna say that dulcimer she plays too. I mean, come on. No one else out there.
It's definitely a little out of time.
Who was the person that Dylan toured with? That's the only other person that comes to mind. I forget her name. That he did the folk tours with.
Joan Baez?
Joan Baez, yeah.
Oh yeah, she's gonna figure into the story.
Oh, great.
Her and Joni were best friends, I'm guessing.
That's funny you mentioned that. No. So okay, but let's stay on the guitar tuning thing for just a second because I wanted to describe it in more detail. We'll get into it with the songs a little bit too, but she pretty much never uses standard tuning for her guitar, which was fairly wild at the time. And in addition to that, she is making up new tunings just for her. So for those who might not know, there is a standard tuning on a 6-string guitar. And then there's also a variety of popular alternate tunings that you'll hear out there, these days, and Led Zeppelin albums and other places, right? But it sounds like alternate tunings generally weren't that common in the late 60s overall. And then also, she doesn't have this musical education that moors her to a specific set of rules. So she's really making up new ones that sound very unique, even to the point where she has her own notation so she can remember how they work. And I think the gist of it is like, it has the sense of just twiddling knobs and making something that works and then kind of writing it down and going back to it. But she covers all this different ground. And a lot of what she's doing, if you want to know the nerdy side of it, is just the guitar is, in standard tuning, it's arranged in fourths. The open strings approximately are spaced by a fourth interval, note-wise. And she does a lot of things where she's changing that to be a fifth or a sixth. Maybe not across the whole neck of the guitar, but it lends itself to certainly different sounding chords, but also it's easier to let more open strings ring out in a lot of different configurations with your chords. And again, part of this was based on the fact that her left hand, the fretting hand, wasn't super strong. And so she wanted to find the easiest ways to make interesting chords, and this was one of those ways.
Yeah, I feel like most of the open tunings are done purposefully in a mathematically consistent way to make either the ability to play all the strings open, and or just make the harmonies of the open strings more closely match each other, because fourths are not that euphonious when played together. And the fact that she's doing it strictly because of like an injury or an impairment, it's just an entire different root cause for doing it. It's going to lead to some weird and wild tunings that probably make no intuitive sense to a person who is not doesn't have that same shortcoming in their ability.
Absolutely. And I'll just go one further and say, you make a great point that most of the alternate tunings that are common are about tuning your guitar such that just playing the strings without your fingers on the neck creates an open chord, a harmonious sound. Like Keith Richards plays almost all his stuff with a tuning like that. But in Joni's case, she is not doing that in most cases, and instead she's having to kind of rewrite or rethink where to put your fingers on the guitar. Guitar players learn these shapes of certain chords, and Joni in a certain way is going at it backwards. She's retuning the guitar to some weird configuration and then just placing her fingers randomly to try to find new chord patterns that maybe you couldn't even achieve with standard tunings. That's one of the reasons all her music sounds quite unique
and annoying to learn as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, forget about learning this.
Yeah.
But again, having an idea of how to like create crazy harmonies with their voice, I mean, must lend itself to that process, compared to someone who doesn't have an idea of how things like harmonies and
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, she certainly has a vocal gift that allows her to vamp a lot of interesting melodies very fluidly in a jazz singer type of way over top of these strange chord constructions. And I think this is where the painting thing comes in too, because she talked about how in color theory, there are rules about colors that are complementary or colors that will clash, for instance. And I would say similarly in music theory, there are rules like that, seemingly. And she just said, forget about all that. The only way to innovate is to forget those rules and do the wrong thing, in quotes, and that's how you get innovation. And she's right.
Doesn't always make it good, though.
Doesn't always make it good. So at this point, right, her recording career's begun, maybe not with a bang. She's working and writing and recording. She's dating David Crosby at this point. She's hanging out in LA with the Canyon family that's starting to coalesce there. That's the Mamas and the Papas. That's Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. That's Jim Morrison. And now look, Joni puts out a string of albums between her debut, which is called Songs to a Seagull in 1968, and Hejira, the album that we're here to talk about, in 1976. And we're going to mention, but kind of breeze past them. But first, here is our absolute favorite, undisputed favorite segment on the podcast. It's the one we all look forward to week after week. It is Joni Mitchell by the numbers. All right, the first number I want to throw out to you is 4. That is the number of albums Joni Mitchell has on Robert Dimery's list of 1001 albums you must hear before you die. Hejira is her 8th record and the last, chronologically speaking, to be on this list. However, it is the first that we are covering. So that is part of the reason I'm going to breeze through this next section and get to this album. Next number is 3. The number of highly public romantic relationships that strongly influenced this album and this period in Joni's life generally. And by the way, I think she had more than 3 relationships, but these are the high profile ones. Relationships and breakups, I should say. So she had these relationships and breakups with James Taylor, Sam Shepard, who is an actor and playwright, and of course, Graham Nash. Next number I want to tell you about is 1.68 million. Speaking of Graham Nash, 1.68 million is the current estimated market price for the 3-bed, 3-bath Laurel Canyon home that Joni and Graham shared together. It's the one he's referring to in Our House. I should point out that Joni broke up with Graham Nash via cryptic telegram.
I mean, I'm sure plenty of people would pay more than that for that place.
That surprises me,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah,
Be worth a lot more.
A little on the cheaper side, definitely.
It's not. Well, it's not on the market right now.
It is not currently on the market, sadly.
Yeah.
But, make an offer, see what happens.
I mean, I remember from the songs from Big Pink episode, that house is worth like 400 grand or something like that. It's like that was a steal. At least 1.6 million. I guess those are California prices.
Those
But
are
still,
California prices.
yeah.
But she bought that house, I think it was back, in the 60s, $36,000. So doing okay.
Yeah.
Doing
Yeah.
okay. Doing okay. Yeah, this is the Hollywood Hills, effectively, that we're talking about here, right?
Yep.
Okay, next number 36. That is the age Joni's at when she records this record. She is not a young artist anymore. She's had success. She's now seeking to figure out what the heck the rest of her life is going to look like. No small task, right? And lastly,
I like how she's like, when I'm 36, trying to figure out what the rest of my life is going to look like. Yet here I am, 7 years later, also still trying to figure out what the rest of my life is going to look like. So good luck, Joni. Maybe get 9 more albums.
Yeah,
in you before you
I was
figure
gonna
that one
say,
out.
plus she had 8 hit albums behind her.
So, well, not 8 hits to be
Well,
fair, but yes,
eight albums.
but she's amassed a career at this point, certainly,
And at
the
least
last,
3 and at least 3 boyfriends.
and many, well, yeah,
Yeah,
more than
I
that.
think more than
Let's
3.
be honest.
Many
Depends on
more.
what you're calling boyfriends, I guess.
Again, no shade to her. Congratulations to her, but
Absolutely
she seems like
not.
many a
Right.
man, even powerful men, were very smitten by her, and she gave them a toss and then gave them the boot. So good on her. And lastly, number 30, as in 30 seconds, to show us some love right now by clicking into our show notes, going to the link at the very top, scrolling down a bit, and adding your email address to our growing mailing list. We send out very periodic updates about behind the scenes things we're doing with the show, give you a heads up on voting for what albums we cover, and of course tell you about the amazing bonus shows we've been producing for our Patreon community. And you can join for free to continue the conversation about Hejira. Tell us what we missed. So, as we say every episode, dearest listeners, we started this podcast to learn more about the thing we love the most, which is music, the history, the characters, the creativity. So please do write us in any way you see fit. Tell us what you think. Tell us where we got it wrong. We'd love to get an email from you. We'd love to be in email contact with you. We love and appreciate all of you listening right now and supporting the show any way you can. Thank you. Okay, back to our story about Joni's career leading up to Hejira. This is where we're going to breeze through the album. So breeze through a series of her albums. She gets her first direct hit song from her 3rd album, Ladies of the Canyon. That's called Big Yellow Taxi. She started playing piano by this point as well, and that album also includes her version of the song Woodstock, written by her, but as you might recall, covered on Deja Vu. That is episode 124 of our show, covered by Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. And I just thought this was an interesting aside. Speaking of Woodstock, I learned this week that she didn't go to the show.
No.
She was supposed to attend. She got to the airport with her new agent, David Geffen, and when he saw the newspaper headline, 400,000 in the mud, he told her that they should skip it. He was afraid, I know, it's a bummer. He was afraid they wouldn't be able to get back in time to make Joni's first national TV appearance on Dick Cavett.
Dick Cavett.
Now, flash forward to the Dick Cavett show, and Joni's getting interviewed, and Crosby and Stills, her ex, actually, yeah, her ex and her close friend, not only attended Woodstock, but played there and then crashed the TV interview and talk about how amazing it is, like right in the middle of her segment. So she's very bummed that she missed it, and you can see in the YouTube video the disappointment on her eyes.
Oh, definitely.
Kind of harrowing.
It's awful. They show up still with mud on them and their guitars and everything. I mean, literally straight from the field.
It's just the worst of all worlds, is what I'm trying to say.
Just getting super shown up too by these guys that roll in and are like, yeah, darling, why don't you close your mouth for now? We're gonna keep talking about how
And then,
great Woodstock is.
Yeah, because they're immediately
weren't
just
there.
saying like, this was the event of the generation. Like, clearly, it's just happened. You missed it.
But
Yeah.
credit to her, she ends up writing this epic song that so beautifully illustrates what happened during those 3-4 days. And she didn't even have to go.
Absolutely. So her response to
Rockstar.
this feeling of missing the most important moment of your generation, she goes home and writes the song Woodstock. She makes lemonade out of lemons. She went out of her way to say, I think that having this kind of third party distant view allowed me to write that song, and it is a terrific song.
Who recorded it first?
It's on Ladies of the Canyon.
She did, I think.
I think
Yeah,
she did.
Ladies of the
Yeah.
Canyon
Okay,
is
gotcha.
70, and I think Deja Vu was 71.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
In
because I
terms of
wonder if she,
recording times, it was probably pretty close though. But
yeah, so I wonder if she wrote it and was like, "Well, I can't possibly sing this. I wasn't there. I'll be
No, her
canceled."
version is great too, actually. But I think the weird thing was at that point, she hadn't actually had a hit record. She was known as a songwriter, and a couple of her songs in other artists' hands had become hits. Big Yellow Taxi was the first thing that was sort of like a hit for her, but still that record didn't sell super well.
Damn, you know what? I actually just realized Ladies of the Canyon released April 1970. Deja Vu released March 1970.
Oh.
So they
A month-
beat
a
her
month
to
apart.
it again. God
Oh,
damn, she
that
must have been
was-
so pissed at them.
Then another step forward, her fourth studio album, Blue, super personal, really establishes her as a songwriting and artistic force to be reckoned with. This one is on Dimery's list. It's the first one of hers. Skip two ahead to her sixth studio album called Court and Spark. This is her real breakthrough success, right? She's known as a talent. She's an underground hit, if you will. I mean, Blue sells pretty well, as does Ladies of the Canyon, but Court and Spark is the mainstream breakthrough. This is in 1974. And that's also on Dimery's list. And it's during that session in particular, or right around that time, she's getting frustrated with rock session musicians, particularly the bass players, who, to her mind, seem stuck on playing only the most obvious notes.
Sounds about right.
She tells a
They're
story.
usually,
No.
they're usually the biggest losers in the band.
Yeah, that's true. But honestly, the 70s for bass was a very productive time. There was a lot of innovation going on in the bass in the 70s. And I thought it was interesting that she's just like, yeah, it's gotten so stale. I'm like, you're talking about probably one of the most productive and innovative periods of bass playing in history. And you're still like, no, these guys suck. Not good enough. I need a like borderline autistic freak bass player who can just
Well,
rip constantly.
I think to be fair to her, I mean, you're right. She's being a little narrow-minded, and that's ultimately why she branches out, right? But it maybe is just a reflection of the studio system that was still carrying over from the late 60s. She's talking about those people, the rock studio musicians that the label kept trying to push on her, who were good enough for a different kind of music, but weren't really necessarily evolving as much with the times. So, like, she tells a story about trying to tell one of these bass players to play an E note over a D chord, and she says it breaks his brain. He's like, that's not the root. She's like, well, it will be if you play it. And, it creates a problem.
It's
Well, I mean,
wild that
that's
she's
just-
it's wild that she's thinking about bass. No one really thinks. Most normal people don't think about that instrument.
Marty, you're a drummer, right?
She has
No,
started
but-
playing piano at this point, and piano is the place where you normally start thinking a little more about strange chord voicings and things like that, and you have to keep bass and bass ideas and even conflicting bass ideas in your mind. So it makes
I
a
just
little more
can't
sense.
imagine a world where a professional studio musician in LA is like, you want me to play an E over a D chord? Boom. What? Like, that's kind of
It's-
nothing, right?
It seemed
Yeah.
weird to me as well, especially given what she's playing. Like, just take a moment and listen to what she's playing on her guitar. and accept that it might be different than the most standard thing you could think of.
Sure. And I feel like the way that she constructs the voicings of her chords gives the bass a lot of room to define that chord
Yeah.
in a way that is not the same if she was just playing the sort of standard low note on the bottom is the root type of chords, you know? So,
Well, super
It-
nerd stuff, but I mean, she actively uses that chord voicing in particular a lot, where she puts the ninth in the bass. So a D chord with an E in the bass, or a G chord with an A in the bass. And it's a very strange, you're right, it gives it's a big part, I think, of what gives it its ethereal quality.
mhm.
And
Yeah.
she could be playing that voicing on a guitar as well, I should point out, right? But that's my general read on what's happening in some of these songs.
Yeah, I feel like you're right. It lacks some punch as a voicing because the low note when it's the root and it's anchoring everything really cuts through.
Yeah.
But when the note that's cutting through is a note that is not an out note, but it's not a defining note, it makes the whole thing kind of seem a little unsettled. Yeah.
Specifically, I think the nine is her favorite kind of note to add to her chords. And it has this very ethereal quality. Maybe the major seven would be another one. But yeah, to your point, Tom, when you land on the one chord or the root note of the key of the song, it gives you this really strong sense of resolution. And it feels like none of her songs really have that super strong, this is home base moment to them. And I think that's very purposeful.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at one of her early hits, I think Big Yellow Taxi, a big part of the reason why that works is she kind of does sort of hammer on some open strings that have a lot of that rootness to them, and it sort of makes it feel more like a pop song, you know?
Absolutely. So, believable or not, that's the story. A friend at this point suggests that the stuff she's talking about is going to be better suited to jazz players, not rock players. Sounds fairly, like she could have gotten there on her own, but okay. So she starts exploring playing with folks from that tradition. Instead, she dabbles with this during Court and Spark. For instance, Larry Carlton plays on that record a bit. But it really starts to come into focus on the follow-up called The Hissing of Summer Lawns in 1975. And that one is the third record of hers on Diamery's list. Now, look, we should say separately, right, that she is already in a no man's land of radio programming. No one knows how to classify her music. She probably sees that as a good thing, but the label, after the success of Court and Spark, which is a little more grounded and poppy, even though it still has her mark on it, for sure, they wanted to stick to that. They wanted to stick to what works and have another hit. And she's like, fuck you guys. I'm going to do whatever. I'm going to go on my jazz exploration journey. So I think Hissing of Summer Lawns, I'm not as familiar with it as I am with Blue and Court and Spark, but I'd say it's the more rocky side of jazz. It feels a little more jazz fusion-y than this, and this feels much more ethereal. Hejira, which is the one that comes next.
She's also really veering into non-marketable album titles at this point.
Oh yeah.
Hissing of Summer Lawns, it's a cool title, but it doesn't pop on a billboard or anything like that, as does Hejira. It's
Yeah.
not a, yeah.
But Hissing of Summer Lawns, ironically, and this is a fun fact, was the favorite album of none other than Prince.
Oh,
wow.
Like
Nice.
of
He
all
was-
time, that was his favorite album.
Like he had mentioned that was his favorite album.
Wow.
He was a huge Joni Mitchell fan, huge, and Hissing of Summer Lawns just did it for him.
Yeah.
I digress, but
No,
that's a fantastic factoid.
That's a great factoid. Yeah, Joni Mitchell, of course, has tons and tons of fans as well. She deserves. And I feel like Blue is the most common fan favorite, let's say.
Mhm.
Court and Spark, like I said, was the breakthrough that everyone owns, and I also think is a great record. And yeah, Hissing feels right for Prince because it's definitely a little more, it's weirder for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He would
I'll-
cover some of his I think, what songs did he cover? He covered a number of her songs in the early 80s when he would perform, which would just blow people's minds because it was so much, out of left field. It was like, what the hell is Prince doing covering a Joni Mitchell song?
Well, actually,
What?
fun fact, Amanda, Rob hates Prince because he sucks.
No.
That's not true at all, and Tom knows it. But
I
I'm
would-
going to
I would-
speak.
I would say quickly, since we're still talking about Summer of Hissing Lawns, it features none other than Jeff Skunk Baxter.
Very
She's
nice.
just pulling all the Steely Dan guitar players off of their projects to come for her.
I was going to say in relation to Prince, and this is, I'd have to fact check this because I don't actually know. But if you just listen to the guitar voicings in Purple Rain, I suspect that they're very similar to a Joni Mitchell style voicing. I suspect that there are a lot of ninth chords and some similar ideas at play. So if you want a easy mental touchstone for the kind of thing I'm talking about, think of that Purple Rain chord progression.
Well, it certainly borrowed the heavy chorus effect on the guitar that she employs all over this album, which not a fan of, by the way, but we'll get to that more when we talk about some specific songs.
So look, now we are finally at tonight's album, Hejira. The word means something like migration or exodus in Arabic, and historically, typically, it refers to Muhammad leaving Mecca for Medina. Joni interprets it to mean a journey fleeing something undesirable, but not a retreat, something more honorable than that. Regardless, it is about traveling. And really, this album is born from a couple of trips that Joni takes right around this time. So, trip number 1, she decides to join Bob Dylan's Rolling Thunder Revue, which is a concert tour that's trying to be a variety show and almost a circus act where anything can happen. This was Dylan's attempt to get away from the rock and roll excess and huge venues that he was playing with the band shortly before that, and instead play small theaters and keep things very, very loose. And this would be right around the time he's writing and recording Desire. So he's got a violin player with him. There's actually a documentary on Netflix about it if you're curious. And the tour is kind of wild. So Joni says everyone is taking their vices to the nth degree. She says after this tour, pretty much everyone ended up either born again or in AA. Dylan is in the former category. This is shortly after that he went to his born again Christian phase, which was not his best look. Joni is in the latter category. She starts doing coke for the first time on this tour and gets fairly deep into it, becomes a cocaine addict. It was already alluded to, but she does not get along with Joan Baez, who is also on the tour, or Bob Dylan, really. Or to be honest, Joni comes off as a bit of a grumpy loner generally, even from a young age. So, take that for what you will.
I mean, staring at a ceiling for 6 months when you're 10 years old probably fucks you up a little bit when it comes to socialization.
And also on this tour is a playwright / actor called Sam Shepard. He's relatively famous, more as a playwright than an actor, but you would probably recognize him if you saw his face. He's been in a bunch of stuff. He is married, and Joni's also in a committed relationship with her drummer, who also appears on this record, but they have an affair while on tour, and everyone finds out about it. So on to trip number 2. Joni, after that, heads out on her own tour for The Hissing of Summer Lawns, her last released album. Now, she has been in a relationship with the drummer in her band, a guy called John Guerin, and in part because of the Sam Shepard affair, they've just broken up, but they still have to play together. That and the cocaine addiction become a bit too much for Joni, and in one of the early run of shows, she runs off stage mid-song and cancels the rest of the tour and goes to stay with her friend Neil Young for a little while. And lastly, trip number 3. After that, she decides to take a cross-country road trip, partially with friends, partially solo, and in disguise. She wants to see America, so she drives from LA to Maine, and then down to Florida, and then all the way back to LA. She's wearing a wig so as not to be recognized. She's using an alias, and she's trying to make some sense of her life at this point and trying to kick cocaine, which she eventually does with the help of a guru, I think, in Arizona.
So wait, she LA to Maine to Florida, back to Arizona, then kicks cocaine. So she's
That's my
scoring in
understanding.
like all of these places. That's if you're not pulling out the Joni Mitchell card, that's got to be pretty hard to find a dealer in those places.
Yeah, well, she takes the wig off when she wants to score, So she comes back home to LA, and now she is ready to record Hejira. This is recorded at a place called A&M Studios. It's mostly done on a 16-track tape machine using some of the earliest chorus guitar pedal ever made available, as well as the MXR Phaser, which had just come out the year before. So we're in the really early days of guitar effects pedals. There are very few of them, and they buy all of them that are available and use them on every song.
That they do.
The producer of the record is a guy called Henry Louis. Now, since the first album experience Joni had with David Crosby, she was rather wary of people calling themselves producers. So she gets a production credit as well, and probably earned it handily, maybe even really is the producer on the record. But from what I can tell, this guy, Henry Louis, was an engineer, and she credited him as a sound advisor on a bunch of her records leading up to this. He's got a lot of credits besides, so he definitely knows what he's doing. He's the listed producer for Harvest and After the Gold Rush, amongst many others. And most of this recording, it sounds like her process to really, they're trying to figure out different things. They're recording in different configurations. Sometimes it's just her trying the songs with her guitar. Sometimes it's just her with a piano. Sometimes it's her with the piano and the drummer who she's broken up with, but who's still playing on this record, and a bass player. And weirdly, so that sounds like a lot of that happened in the sessions, but I don't think any piano made it to the record, interestingly enough. It is only at the very end of the session that someone tells her about the even weirder bass player out of Florida named Jaco Pastorius. He had just joined Weather Report and recorded his first album with them called Black Market. And we probably mentioned this on our Weather Report episode, but I believe his MO was to always introduce himself as, "Hello, I'm Jaco Pastorius. I'm the greatest bass player who's ever lived," or something similar. So she liked his moxie. And he basically comes in and overdubs on only 4 songs. He's the absolute last thing that gets added to the songs, and she gives him pretty much free reign to do whatever he wants. As
you could tell. You could totally hear. Yeah, it's probably just she probably just pressed play,
Exactly.
I think that there's probably a lot of stuff that ended up on the cutting room floor from that, because in some of the songs he's only in for 30% of the song, and I'm sure he was not exercising taste or patience in those scenarios. He was playing the entire time.
Yeah, that doesn't really seem like his deal.
No, that's not his style.
I should say the other bass player, I think there are 2 other bass players, but the other guy who's on a few tracks named Max Bennett, he's no slouch. He was used to doing a lot of soundtrack sessions. He's on the Enter the Dragon soundtrack as an example, as well as on the previous Joni record.
That soundtrack, which we all know, Enter the Dragon.
Yes.
Hell yeah, dude. You don't like Kung Fu soundtracks?
I don't know that one. Sorry.
But I think it's soundtrack. Here like,
You know what? To be fair, when Rob says stuff like that, you just go, "Oh yeah," and let it move on.
That one.
Let him.
I think I'm going
to listen to that after this. I'm going to put that on.
I like soundtrack music. What do you want me to say? And okay, so Hejira comes out. It was well received. It charts at number 13 on Billboard in the U.S. It has sold 500,000 records in the U.S. to date, thus is certified gold. But sadly, it is the last record of Joni's that is on Robert Dimery's list. Some might say the last great record of her career, although she continued to release records, at least 10 more records between now and she's still alive right now at this day. I don't know when the last one she had released came out, but
2007.
2007, yeah. She's been a bit of a recluse since then, but I know she periodically plays shows and releases albums.
Yeah, she's made a couple appearances in the last year, I think,
Mm-hmm.
for an awards show or something.
She had a lot of health problems, so she stepped out of the public eye.
She's a legendary cigarette smoker, I think.
Yeah,
I think she still does smoke.
80, smoked her whole life, had a cocaine period. That's probably not going to lead to you being super spry as you're entering into your 80s.
Right.
And I assume the polio had lasting,
there we go, partial paralysis as well.
So, not a good run. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, with that story concluded, I say we talk about some of these songs. What do you say?